Hi everyone, this is Keith Stone, and I'm here again with Greg Nagy and Claudia and Sarah and Hélène to talk about heroes. And specifically, we're going to talk today about hours 22 and 23 from Greg's book on the ancient Greek hero in 24 hours. But today, so again, 22 and 23. And we're going to start by looking at some things related to hour 22. So I'm just going to start sharing my screen immediately here um, with that. Okay, here we go. Hope you can see it now, coming up. And this is
Perfect.
called The Last Words of Socrates in the Place That He Died.
Yes. And and if you could make the screen a little bigger for old folks like me,
Sure, let me zoom in a little. How's
uh,
this?
much better, much better. And I should give some background. Maybe if you scroll down and we look at the first picture, there we are. And and you notice that the picture was taken by a wonderful person called um, his last name is Lambert. And which one of you would like to talk about this wonderful person?
Well, you know Hunt best. Oh,
Well,
Ellen, I see that you unmuted yourself.
Yeah, because I was on a trip with Hunt and his wonderful wife Kelly, and he was a wonderful companion. And
yes,
he was really telling us many stories for the back of the of what we were doing. He
yes,
he knows a lot, and he took wonderful pictures while we were doing the trip. And I still remember him in Delphi telling about how the position of Delphi was wonderful because people in Delphi could see who was coming. So,
yes,
all
yes,
kinds of little things that he told us.
yes, yes. And at that point, Hunt Lambert was the dean of continuing education, of the Division of Continuing Education, um, DCE. And he was also, and is also, an idealist. And he and his wife, Kelly, were fellow travelers on what I like to call sometimes a journey of a soul, a travel study to Greece, usually 5 days of contact hours. And at one point, both Hunt and his wife, Kelly, were part of the team. And I'm happy to say that our colleagues here, both Hélène and Sarah, are, shall we say, graduates of that travel study program that usually happens in March. This particular picture that Hunt took dates back to 2015. That's 10 years ago now. And I was reminiscing with Hélène and Sarah, who have done this travel study trip with me in different years, how it's now been 10 years since I have been faithfully going back to this site every March, except for the COVID year, I think. Um, so that's many years of visiting this site. And maybe Sarah, you could tell our friends out there what archaeologists say is the significance of this site. It's just the foundation stones of a building in the Agora, a part of the Athenian Agora, let's call it marketplace, where tourists almost never go. So, Sarah, do you want to say something about what this place is, according to the archaeologist Eugene Vanderpool?
Well, this, as the caption says, the Athenian state prison, and Socrates was imprisoned, sentenced to death. And I have a very vivid memory of visiting this part of the Agora, because you had me read the very last words of Socrates, that last
Yes.
passage where the death of Socrates is recounted and where we hear his very last words. And it was an incredibly moving, it's a really moving passage. It gets me every time, but to read it at that actual place just made a huge connection for me. And I was thinking a little bit more about it because there I was reading those words, speaking those words again, which Plato reports that Phaedo reports of the words of Socrates. And so we've got an onward transmission. So I felt very much part of that onward transmission. It gets repeated and recycled. And Greg, I think you've got a lot to say about that.
That was so beautiful, Sarah. And you were the class of, what year was it where we visited this site?
2018.
2018. And now, what about my friend Hélène? What class were you in when we visited this same site?
2017, and we were there with Hunt and Kelly also.
Yes.
And I was deeply moved because when I was very young, when I was a student, my professor at university asked me to read the Apology of Socrates in Greek and to read it, very carefully for 3 months in Greek, and then to record the Apology of Socrates in Greek on a tape, because at that time we had tapes,
Oh my God,
And,
that's wonderful.
yeah.
I didn't know that. Oh, wonderful.
So for me, that, like Sarah, makes me cry. I mean, every time that I read it, because it's so emotional and the text is so powerful.
Yes,
Yes.
And
I don't know if it's true, but they say that
please.
Gandhi, when he was in jail, read the Apology and translated it also because he knew some Greek. So, this is a powerful text.
Oh,
And
yes, yes. And something else that we might think about is that in the Phaedo, which is where Plato, as the head of the academy, puts together a narrative about the death of Socrates in the state prison, in the Desmoterion, and the great archaeologist Eugene Vanderpool, as I said before, has made a very convincing case that what we're looking at in this photograph are the foundations of the Desmoterion, the Athenian state prison, where Socrates was forced to drink the pharmakon, which we translate as poison in this case. And we even know what the substance of the poison was, which is hemlock, in ancient Greek konion. This place where this happened is narrated just as my friends Sarah and Hélène were pointing out. This was narrated in a written text, and the writer was Plato, obviously, but what he wrote was a dialogue between one of the followers of Socrates, who was actually there when Socrates was forced to drink the poison, and his name was Phaedo, and somebody who was a sympathizer, but who was not in Athens and was not there. And so Phaedo is telling the story. So as you wonderful people out there heard, it's like a channeling of an eyewitness account. But then the question is, what about Plato? And at the very beginning of this dialogue, which is named after the narrator, who was a follower of Socrates and who's telling what happened at this prison on the day that Socrates died, this setting up of the narrative by Phaedo um, leads Echecrates to ask the question, and who were there? And so Phaedo lists the people who were there, and then suddenly he mentions Plato. And then the question is, oh, Plato, um, well, he was, and the Greek says arroste, which means it could be translated, and it is translated by some Victorian translators, as he was sick. And you think of students who, I'm being playful, quote unquote, sick out of an examination or sick out of an important event. But uh, I, I, in my old age, have come to think that this is not what it really means. It means he was just not up to it to be present in the narrative that Phaedo says. He doesn't, the text doesn't say that he wasn't there. He just wasn't up to being part of the group of people who were in the narrative of Phaedo, narrated as being there when Socrates died. So it's a very strange thing, and it's a historical fact that if you look at all the writings of Plato that have survived through the centuries, and these writings were, shall we say, safeguarded by Plato's Academy for many, many centuries. And so today's researchers may say, oh, this particular work of Plato is not really by Plato, it's by a follower in some later time, and people start saying pseudo-Plato and everything. But the fact is that in all the writings of Plato that are attributed to Plato by the Academy, and we're not going to count the letters, which is a separate problem, Plato is mentioned in the writings of Plato only two times. One time in the Apology, where Socrates is saying, my, there's so many people turning out at this trial where I am going to have to give a speech in defense of my life and times. And that's what the apology means. In Greek, apologia is not, hey, I'm sorry. It means I am defending my life in front of my fellow citizens who have put me on trial on various charges that I reject. And that's what Plato's Apology is. So he's mentioned there once, and the only other time is at the beginning of the Phaedo, where when Echecrates, who was not there, he was definitely not there, is asking Phaedo, who definitely was there, well, who were there? and, and there Plato is mentioned, but not as somebody who was there, but somebody who wasn't up to it. Have a wonderful trip. I'll be thinking of you. And so I guess we snipped that part. But anyway, so where was I? Claudia, am I okay if I continue where we left off?
Yeah, totally great. Yeah. And what was great is, you had a little pause there, Greg, and I can literally see the silence. And so I can find the edit quickly. So that's super helpful, actually.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. So what's amazing to me is the self-effacing of Plato. Here he is reporting what Socrates says to people who engage in dialogue with Socrates, but he erases himself from being anywhere when Socrates is having a dialogue. It's as if he wasn't there. And I think we have to treat this strange reference to how Plato wasn't up to it in the Phaedo as a way of Plato's signature is, I don't want to intrude myself in this. I'm concentrating on Socrates. He always concentrates on Socrates. And could I say, this is for people out there who have been studying Plato for Plato's sake, let's say, because they're interested in Plato's philosophy. And philosophers today I think rightly so, we'll talk about Plato's Socrates, because look, Socrates had other students like Xenophon, Xenophon, who was also very much involved with the teachings of Socrates. And it says an enormous amount of historical data about Socrates, and who also, like Plato, stages in many situations what Socrates says to his followers. But frankly, Xenophon's Socrates and Plato's Socrates don't seem to have the same personality. At least for me, Plato's Socrates is very likable, whereas Xenophon's Socrates, I'm not so sure. Uh, but going back to this question about, well, was Plato there or not? In a way, it doesn't matter, because what Plato wants is for Socrates to live in the text of the Phaedo. But it's not so much the text as something that is written up, as something that is an accurate account of exactly what Socrates said. No, the whole point of all the dialogues that Socrates is engaging in the works of Plato, the whole point is that Socrates never figures out everything in a dialogue. It's a question of exercising, a self-exercising in, here's the word, theoria, Theoria. And for Athenians, in the year 399 BCE, which is when Socrates was put to death, for Athenians, theoria means a sacred journey from point A to sacred place B, and a journey back from sacred place B to place A. Place A is Athens. Place B, the sacred place, is the island of Delos, or Delos in the way it was pronounced back in 399 BCE, Delos, the island of Apollo, god of intelligence, god of Musike. Now, Musike is translated, especially by Victorian translators, as music. But the thing is, when Socrates says at one point while he's in jail that a beautiful woman appeared to him in a dream, and this beautiful woman, who must have been a goddess, was saying, Socrates, practice musike. And so Victorians will translate it as do music. But we know for a fact, and really the texts of Plato show this, that musike is, yes, for example, composition of lyric poetry. That's why we translate musike as music, but even epic poetry, which was not set to music in the 5th and 4th century, it was recitative, but nevertheless they called that musike as well. But here's the thing, it's also the practice of dialogue, Socratic dialogue, which the followers of Plato called musike. So when the beautiful goddess appears to Socrates in a dream and says, do music, what that means is do philosophy, because philosophy is the number one kind of musike. Isn't that wonderful? And so then Socrates is saying to himself, why did this beautiful goddess say to me in my dream, do music? Suppose I were a long distance runner or a short distance runner, and I'm running, and people who are cheering for me say, run, run, run. And you think to yourself, well, I am running. And so why is the lady saying to me, do musike? I am doing musike. But then he condescends, well, okay, I'll compose while I'm in jail, a Homeric hymn to Apollo, and I'll compose some fables of Aesop, which goes from the highest forms of verbal art to what is considered by social snobs the lowest form, which is fables, like Aesopic fables. So anyway, there are all of these interesting cross-references to what is actually going on. But because in our meetings, we've been concentrating a lot on heroes, and heroes not only as characters in epic, like Homeric poetry, and lyric, like Sappho, but also in terms of religious practice. And by religious, I prefer to say practice involving ritual and ritual's connectivity with myth. And if you look at it that way, that's what's going on here. Then, of course, it's very important that heroes are not just characters in epic and lyric, they're also like stylized ancestors in a community where they're worshipped as if they were ancestors in practices that in other cultures would be called ancestor worship. So the thing is, we're talking about hero cult, and we have been ever since we were reading the Iliad. And yet, these characters in tragedy, and even further back in epic, these characters were already then venerated in real life as cult heroes. So here's where I find it most interesting and relevant to everything we've said so far about the death of Socrates, that it has been proved, and I show the evidence for it and the arguments for it in classical continuum for what is now dated November the 19th. And I wonder if we could have a peek at that particular. There it is, on traces of hero cults for Socrates and Plato. So it turns out, and this has been proved, that in Plato's Academy, which is this beautiful choice piece of real estate, can I call it, very near Colonus, which is the real estate, or may I put it more accurately, the district where Sophocles was born. And I can't resist thinking that Plato wanted to have control or custodianship of property that's very near to Sophocles' birthplace. So in the academy, which was a huge chunk of, at that point, sort of outside the main city, in this deme, it turns out that both Socrates and Plato were worshipped as cult heroes. I'm sure that Socrates would have disapproved in his own lifetime that this would happen, but obviously Plato did not disapprove of how in eventuality, he too, like Socrates, was worshipped as a cult hero in Plato's Academy in the region of very near the city center, but not at the city center, where the academy was located. Of course, in modern Athens, which is like half the population of the Republic of Greece, it's very much part of central city Athens. But back then, it was, shall we say, more bucolic. And I love the fact that somebody like Socrates, and this is a historical fact, Socrates was executed on the same day when he was born. So his birthday and his death day are the same. And I think that is very conducive for people to start thinking, oh, then he should be worshipped as a cult hero. But certainly in the Phaedo, you don't get the idea that Socrates will be a cult hero, do you? Of course you don't, because Socrates is so busy proving that it doesn't matter whether death is followed by no afterlife or afterlife. And if you're going to say that, then how can you position yourself as a future cult hero. But I love the way he does say that, and he does things that definitely contradict the idea of how he would ever become a cult hero. But the historical fact is that he did become a cult hero, and Plato became a cult hero. But let's just imagine what the argumentation, as far as philosophers are concerned, is embedded in the dialogue that we call the Phaedo. And by the way, Plato experts think of this dialogue as exoteric, not esoteric, which means it's not just for insiders, that would be esoteric, it's also for outsiders. So even though I might be an amateur about philosophy and I might know only the rudiments of what Plato's theory of forms is, as philosophers talk about the Phaedo, oh, that's that exoteric work of Plato where you get the best definition of Plato's theory of forms. Well, of course, it's Socrates who's saying all of this, but anyway, I think you take my point that it's sort of contradictory almost, but because we are concerned with the concept of a hero, I'm taking seriously the fact that the Academy treated both Socrates and Plato as cult heroes. So that means when you think of the philosophical argument that's going on in the Phaedo, especially the first part, where two young, may I put it this way, smart alecks called Simmias and Kebes are arguing that the Pythagorean theory of harmonia, which doesn't mean harmony, but means the tuning of a lyre, that the Pythagorean theory of harmonia, accordatura, tuning of a lyre, is a way to prove the immortality of the psyche. The immortality of, shall we translate psyche as soul, even though you all, my dear colleagues, know that in Homeric terms, it's almost misleading to say soul, but by the time of Plato, I give up. We might as well translate psyche as soul. And so what's weird about the Phaedo is that two of the participants in these dialogues that are going on between people who are interested in the thinking of Socrates, and these are these young philosophers called Simmias and Kebes, how they're intent on disproving the immortality of the psyche. And you say, wow, that's not very helpful on the last day of Socrates, where basically they're arguing, and very successfully, that the Pythagorean theoria, let's call it the cosmic view of the psyche, that it doesn't work, and that there's no immortality after death, and therefore the psyche is not like the Pythagorean model of the tuning of all music, so to speak, the music of the lyre, the 7-string lyre of Apollo. That just doesn't work. And so a dear colleague of mine who was at one point my student, David Elmer, when he was at one point a teaching fellow in the college version of Ancient Greek Hero in 24 Hours, he used this wonderful term of inset. And what he meant was that at the beginning of the Phaedo, here are these two followers of Socrates. One of them was there at the moment of death, the other one wasn't. And so the one who was there is telling the story and is telling the argumentation of these two smart alecks who say there is no immortality for the psyche. And then you know what happens? The dialogue that is reported by Phaedo, the character, shall we say, but also the real life person, Phaedo, that dialogue breaks down. And so that's what David Elmer calls, well, the inset narrative breaks down. And Socrates says, wow, so this is very uninspiring. This is really demoralizing. So what happens? And then you know what happens? Phaedo says, well, wait a minute. actually, then Socrates brought the dialogue back to life, he says, by coming up with new arguments for the immortality of the psyche. And you can say, well, maybe he wasn't as convincing as the two smart Alecs were in the earlier part of the Phaedo. But the point is that there is an actual breakdown of the dialogue as staged by Plato. And then Socrates rescues it and brings the dialogue back to life. Wow. Well, that has to do with concepts of hero cult, where people who worship heroes say, well, the hero we worship died because all mortals have to die. But, and then there are, many, many different kinds of belief systems about how a hero comes back to life after death. Or may I put it another way, how the psyche gets reunited with the body. And that's one of the reasons in Homeric poetry, we just don't hear about that, because Homeric poetry is trying to be as non-localized when it comes to myth and ritual as possible. Everybody dies, so it's easy to talk about that. But how people come back to life after death, these larger than life models for us who are the cult heroes, well, there are just so many variations that it's just better not to talk about it. So that's why when we started our own journey of a soul with the Iliad, we didn't hear that much about coming back to life after death, now did we? But now this is a hot topic, and so sure enough, the dialogue gets second wind, as it were, and I love what happens, which is that when the hour of death comes and people start losing control of their emotions, and they start crying and crying and crying. And at one point, Socrates is trying to console them. And he says to Phaedo, he says, don't mourn for me when I die. Mourn only if, I'm going to die, but mourn if the word that we're engaging in, and the word is logos, and what Socrates means is Socratic dialogue, mourn only if the word dies with me. And here is what is so wonderful, if I can go back to thus Socrates lived in the text of the Phaedo, as I put it provocatively at the beginning of our meeting today. What fascinates me about that question is that, in a sense, he not only lives in the text, but he lives in the text only if it's not just the text, but the words that are functioning in the text, and how the words are exchanged between an older person and a younger person. Or let's say a senior learner and a junior learner. Can I put it that way? And philosophers even talk about the fact that there's something called Socratic aporia, or dialectic aporia. Aporia means there's no way out, or it means, okay, we reached a dead end, or not a dead end, but we reached a point where the argumentation breaks down, or it gets wobbly, or gets uncertain. And look, it's a fact that in the dialogues as staged by Plato in Plato's texts, the words that are exchanged, the logos that is exchanged in Socratic dialogue between Socrates and whoever is staged as arguing with him, they never wind up in a place where everything is all figured out. Socrates has solved all these problems of the universe. No, his theoria, his journey of a soul, is open-ended. That's what aporetic dialogue means. The dialogue is not ending with Socrates. It has to be continued with the people who were having their dialogue with Socrates. And then those people will have to not be the last word either, because then it's the next generation and next generation, which is why we as a group of academics are so, I know all of us are, devoted to intergenerational models of learning, because that's the basic Socratic teaching. And yet, in a sense, it's still modeled on the hope in hero cult that a hero, he or she, when they die, they will come back to life again. And it's a mysterion, it's a mystery how it happens, because each community practically has its own scenario for how that happens. But it does, in terms of the tenets of hero cult and why people worship cult heroes, it does happen. And in that sense, even though Socrates is not overtly talking about hero cult, he really as a subtext, is talking about hero cult. And even when there's that statement about invoking Heracles, who, of course, for us as learners of what an ancient Greek hero is, would be the most prototypical of all heroes. And there's even talking about how Heracles is the savior, he's the rescuer. But in this particular dialogue, Socrates is the savior because he saves the word. He saves the word after the young ones kind of demolish the word. And as David Elmer would say, then there's the inset, which is the staged dialogue between two people remembering about the death of Socrates. It really gets interrupted and then it gets recontinued, which I think is a wonder. So maybe we can now go back to that picture that we saw of the foundations of the state prison. And if you can share the screen, there's a museum in the Agora. It's quite a walk away from where we're standing now. And this picture by Hunt Lambert, there it is. That picture was taken in 2015. Similarly here, what archaeologists actually found at that site where you just saw the foundation stones and nothing else, they did find these little containers, vials, that were actually used by the state to execute people because they're containers for hemlock. And there they are on display. Now, am I saying that any one of these that excavators found at that site is the one that Socrates drank hemlock from? Not at all, because archaeologists can't figure out exactly what the date of these vials is. So nobody's claiming this would be 399 BCE, any one of these. It could be, but who's claiming that? You don't need to. But it shows you that the Athenian state did execute a fair number of people. And there's the material evidence, the evidence of material culture. Any comments by you wonderful people? There's so many things to comment about.
So here's what I'm wondering, Greg, and this might not be a place where you want to take the conversation, and that's fine. For a long time, I've been thinking about ideas about what actually does happen to the soul. Let's say Indo-European conceptions about how the soul does reintegrate with the body and why we would be seeing certain themes. Like, so I love this idea that the logos has the way that a philosopher like Socrates can revive the logos is in any way metaphorically associated with the success of the soul achieving immortality, right? And I'm thinking too about the tradition of performance of a work like the Iliad and the Odyssey, which you have talked about would have maybe happened at certain festivals, and it would have happened in a relay with one performer performing part of it, and then there would have to be, he would have to finish his section, and then another performer would have to pick up another part of it, right?
Exactly.
And I'm thinking too, yes, a performance in relay. And I'm thinking too about your work on a proemion sort of like the introductory hymn that might happen before a performance like that. You also have these moments. So I know we don't really get a lot of talk about exactly how this is going to happen, but do you feel like this sense of there's, in life, or, you're a hero, you're fighting on the battlefield, fight, 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 you die, and then there's a period where you go to Hades, and Hades is a temporary place, I think is kind of what you argue, right?
Yes.
That's not the final resting place of the hero. Right.
Transitional. It's not a final resting place.
So the hero has to find a way to get from there to the Isle of the Blessed, or the fields of Asphodel, where what we see is Achilles running. So he's like actively running. This hero who, in the Iliad, who is known for his speed, stuck in his tent the whole time. But in the afterlife, what do we see? He's running. So do you think those?
Yeah, he's free.
Yeah, go, please, say more.
No, keep going. Do I think that?
Well, yeah, I guess I'm trying to understand. Do you think that those are Greek visions of the afterlife, or do you think that the way that is coming from so many places, that's an Indo-European influence on thoughts of the afterlife?
So here's the wonderful thing, and this goes back now to the apology, which our dear colleague Hélène worked on so astutely back when. Could I say that one of my favorite parts of the apology, which again means the defense of his own life, is he says, well, the trial where I am being held responsible for my own life and having to defend whether I should end my life or not. This trial, which in Greek is dike, which means absolute justice, which is something that is represented by the cult hero after death, if everything works out fine. He says, well, this dike, where my life is at stake, is a situation where I need to think of, well, what happens after I die? Because the stakes are, if I'm pronounced innocent, then I keep living. If I'm not, I have to terminate my life. I'm forced to terminate my life. And he says, well, it's not really that bad if I die, he says in the apology, because even if there's no afterlife, he says that in the apology, not in the Phaedo. If there's no afterlife, then death would be like a good night's sleep, where you don't even dream, you just have a good night's sleep. That's it. Of course, what's funny about that particular statement is, all right, if that's what death is, a good night's sleep, presumably you know when you wake up that, gee, I had a good night's sleep. But let's not quibble. He says there are two scenarios. Either there's no life after death, but he says this in a playful way, or he says, if there is, am I going to be happy? And Claudia, this is where you're mentioning Indo-European traditions really comes in, because Plato, unlike most sources in the 5th and 4th century, is very fastidious about talking about proto-poets. And even Herodotus skips over this one particular proto-poet called Orpheus. So Herodotus will not even mention Orpheus where he should be mentioning it, says, well, there's Homer and Hesiod. But whenever in the works of Plato, proto-poets are mentioned, here's the sequence. And did you hear me say sequence? Or here's the relay. Here's the diadoche, that's the Greek word. The reception. Reception means one generation to the next. First, there was Orpheus. Second, there was Musaeus, which means the man of the muse, which, wow, that's like the transmitter from Orpheus. Third is Hesiod, and fourth is Homer. Homer is only fourth in a sequence of poetic traditions. Well, I, as an Indo-Europeanist, now know, because of new archaeological discoveries about so-called passports, they're called golden sheets that are buried along with the dead in many situations. There are now several of these gold lamellae, which are like passports that depend on poetic traditions that are attributed to Orpheus, not to Musaeus, even not to Hesiod, not to Homer. And those traditions really do deal with afterlife. And so what Socrates does is actually do a riff about Orphic afterlife. If there is an afterlife, well, it must be like what we know from Orphic traditions. And what are Orphic traditions? Orphic traditions is the psyche goes down to Hades, which is a transition. And then the psyche, if they're just, they find their way to their private paradise, which is not private because it's reunion with the ancestors. So what you were saying are Indo-European traditions. And I'll think of one tradition in particular, the hymns of the Rig Veda, where it's really spelled out. So you were talking about a verbal art tradition, which is presented in language that is related to Greek. I mean, is cognate to Greek. So yeah, it's an Indo-European tradition. Greek traditions had it too. It's just that Homeric poetry kind of, how shall I say it, shades over those kinds of traditions that there's a lot of disagreement about, and highlights those traditions that there's a lot of agreement about. I call that in my works Pan-Hellenism. Orphic traditions are not Pan-Hellenic, they're very localized. And so here it comes, my dear friends. He says, if there is an afterlife, that means that I will be judged. And then he names who are the most just, who are the most decay-centered heroes who died in the past. And my favorite one is Iacchos, who is the ancestor of Achilles and the ancestor of Ajax. And there are others, it gets complicated, but he says, wow, if I get to have an afterlife, and then he starts talking about how the first person I want to interview is Achilles. And then, okay, I also want to interview Ajax, and I'm not sure I want to interview Odysseus because he's so morally questionable. And at that point, Socrates, and I love this, Claudia, Socrates actually recomposes the Iliad because he says, if I interviewed Achilles, I would ask him, why are you saying one thing in Iliad 9, where I'll die, but I'll have a kleos that is unwilting forever? That's in Iliad 9. And why do I say then, why do you, Achilles, say in Iliad 18, now that Patroclus is dead, I have to die because it's the just thing to do. It's something that it's as close as you can get to decay in the Iliad. Wow, that means that Plato has actually figured out the sort of two wobbly parts of Homeric poetry, where in Iliad 9, Achilles hasn't figured things out yet, and he doesn't talk about decay, but in Iliad 18, he does talk about decay, as if now he has to uphold the principles of the straight line versus the crooked line. Well, that's the number one symbol for what it is to be a hero, is to figure out how to go in a straight line from A to B. So how do you like that, dear Claudia? I'm saying that Socrates actually recomposes the Iliad in the course of imagining his interview with Achilles. He also wants to interview Ajax and Palamedes. And yeah, I'll interview Odysseus as well, sure. But he's so questionable as a moral agent, et cetera, et cetera. Isn't that amazing?
Amazing. Sarah, what did you want to add?
Sorry, I wondered if I could just jump in a little bit with Greg, you were talking about decay and being the most just. And I was remembering that's the very, very last word that Phaedo says in the dialogue called the Phaedo, he says of Socrates, he was the most just, the most dikaios.
Exactly, exactly, exactly. And if you like, one way we could end, if you want, I don't want this dialogue to end, obviously, but if we were to, let's say, interrupt our continuum and then continue later, wouldn't it be fun if we could share? I have the text for November 17th. And what Sarah just said, wouldn't it be fun for Sarah to read the end?
And while he was saying this, he took the cup to his lips, and quite readily and cheerfully, he drank down the whole dose. Up to this point, most of us have been able to control fairly well our urge to let our tears flow. But now, when we saw him drinking the poison and then saw him finish the drink, we could no longer hold back. And in my case, quite against my own will, my own tears were now pouring out in a flood. So I covered my face and had a good cry. You see, I was not crying for him, but at the thought of my own bad fortune in having lost such a comrade. Crito, even before me, found himself unable to hold back his tears. So he got up and moved away. And Apollodorus, who had been weeping all along, now started to cry in a loud voice, expressing his frustration. So he made everyone else break down and cry, except for Socrates himself. And he said, "What are you all doing? I am so surprised at you. I had sent away the women mainly because I did not want them to lose control in this way. You see, I have heard that a man should come to his end in a way that calls for measured speaking. So you must have composure and you must endure." When we heard that, we were ashamed and held back our tears. He, meanwhile, was walking around until, as he said, his legs began to get heavy. And then he lay on his back. That is what the man had told him to do. Then that same man who had given him the poison took hold of him, now and then checking on his feet and legs. And after a while, he pressed his foot hard and asked him if he could feel it. And he said that he couldn't. And then he pressed his shins and so on, moving further up, thus demonstrating for us that he was cold and stiff. Then he, Socrates, took hold of his own feet and legs, saying that when the poison reaches his heart, then he will be gone. He was beginning to get cold around the abdomen. Then he uncovered his face, for he had covered himself up, and said, this was the last thing he uttered, "Crito, I owe the sacrifice of a rooster to Asclepius. Will you pay that debt and not neglect to do so?" "I will make it so," said Crito. "And tell me, is there anything else?" When Crito asked this question, no answer came back anymore from Socrates. In a short while, he stirred. Then the man uncovered his face. His eyes were set in a dead stare. Seeing this, Crito closed his mouth and his eyes. Such was the end, Echecrates, of our comrade, and we may say about him that he was in his time the best of all men we ever encountered, and the most intelligent and most just.
There it is. That's so beautiful. And so Dike, which is the emblem of a cult hero, is vindicated. And so the how shall I say it? The subtext of the cult of heroes is there. And it's interesting that he's saying, well, I sent the women away, but what the wife of Socrates actually says is usually misinterpreted, because it's not that he's saying, oh, get that woman out of here because she's lamenting. She is quoted as saying, this is the wife of Socrates, she is quoted as saying in the Phaedo of Plato that I'm not crying for you, I'm crying for everybody who will who may not have dialogues anymore. So again, it's crying. So it's a very intelligent statement by the woman. Is the real lament is if the word dies, not if somebody dies. So you see what I'm saying? It is a reinforcement. And then what does this mean to sacrifice a rooster to Asclepius? So, dear Claudia, do you mind if we just have a quick look at what I tried to write in on November the 19th
Yes.
for Classical Continuum, because there's, and Claudia, you helped me with this picture. There's a statue of Asclepius with his snake. Um, um, and this statue has actually been found in Epidaurus, which is the #1 shrine of Asclepius in the era of the Hellenistic period. Although Athens, at the foot of the Acropolis, also had a very important shrine. The reason, while we're looking at this picture, I want you to remember that Asclepius used to be worshipped as a hero, and he was worshipped as a god only when the very idea of worshiping heroes was getting so passé that it was just easier to hang on to the idea of worshiping gods. Gods were the last to go before Christianity replaced worship of gods and heroes. So first heroes went out of business, and then gods went out of business. But in the case of Asclepius, his earlier phase is hero cult, his later phase is god cult. But let's concentrate on Asclepius as a hero, which you still see all sorts of attestations for, especially in Pindar. Asclepius is the son of Apollo. So he has a mortal mother, but his father is the immortal Apollo. And of course, Apollo is not only the god of intellect and not only the god of musike, which we'll say is music and philosophy and everything, poetry, verbal art, and naturally also philosophy. Apollo is also the god of healing. And that's why in the Oedipus Tyrannos, you remember how the people prayed to Apollo as the Soter, as the savior who is in charge of healing. And so the thing is, this Asclepius, he starts off being a mortal, as I say in earlier versions of the myth. He's really good at healing people. In fact, he gets to be so good at it that at least in one case, he brings the dead back to life. Uh-oh, you're not supposed to do that as a mortal. Only Apollo should do that. And so he gets vaporized by the thunderbolt of Zeus, which is okay because then he becomes this healing cult hero. That's fine. But what I am saying is that, as we know from Pausanias, the traveler who had this propensity to interview not tour guides, but the local priest or local priestess whenever he came to a given community. When Pausanias, this traveler in the 2nd century CE, is in Troezen, which is one of the places where Asclepius is worshipped. And then he goes to Epidaurus, where he's worshipped. It turns out that the native populations in that part of the world are in denial. Can I put it in the kind of pseudo-psychological way? They're in denial about whether Asclepius really died. And they point to the sky, where there's the charioteer, and that's Hippolytus. So it's as if, oh, Hippolytus might have died, but he lives again. And Pausanias even uses that wonderful formula, hutos ekenos. This one is that one up in the sky. He's the auriga, he's the charioteer. And so, although they don't say it directly because it's a mystery, they're really telling Pausanias, oh, even if myth says that Hippolytus died, he has come back to life after death, and there he is, driving his chariot in the sky. And it's a reaffirmation of, shall we say, the ancestral way of thinking that heroes come back to life after death. So what does that mean for Socrates? Well, why would you want to sacrifice a rooster to Asclepius? Well, the person he's saying this to is a fellow native of the same Deimos where Socrates was born. So they have the same Mother Earth in terms of districts of Athens. So Crito would know the same ritual practices about afterlife that Socrates would know. If you were from another deme, as all the other followers of Socrates were at the occasion of his death, they wouldn't really understand fully what Socrates is saying to the local boy, that's Crito. And so let me reconstruct what happens when you sacrifice a rooster to Asclepius. You go to the shrine, and they have places for worshipers to be incubated. And to incubate means you have a sacred sleep. But before the sacred sleep, you're supposed to sacrifice a rooster to Asclepius. Oh, my eye hurts, or whatever the malady is. And you pray to Asclepius while you sacrifice the rooster. Please, 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 when I wake up, make my eyes not sore anymore, or whatever it is. And we have all these narratives incised in stone that describe what happens to people when they incubate at Hotel Asclepius. And there are several, I call it Hotel Asclepius, there's several shrines where this kind of thing would be taking place. Anyway, what happens is you sacrifice the rooster the night before, and then you wake up. And just suppose that your eye feels better. And meanwhile, what's the first thing that happens when you wake up early in the morning? A rooster is crowing. So, shall we say, the voice of the dead rooster becomes alive again with the voice of the live rooster come dawn. When dawn happens, sun rises, the cycle starts all over again. Isn't that amazing?
Amazing. It's gorgeous. Wow. Okay. So, Greg, I know we can't have a last word, especially not on
no such thing
discussion like this. So, but perhaps this is a good point for us to say goodbye until next time. I do want to be aware that
exactly.
Yes, about people's time. And we do hope that everyone who is following along shares their thoughts, their insights, their questions. They can post those in the comments beneath the video. Yeah, and so I hope they'll join the discussion. I want to thank everyone for joining us. Sarah, Hélène, Keith, and of course, Greg. We so appreciate your time and that you join us for these conversations. It means a lot. So until next time.
Till the next time.